From the state capitol in Albany, Governor Hugh Carey's message to the legislature, the State of the State address. Both houses of the state legislature have gathered in the Assembly Chamber to hear Governor Carey's 7th overview of New York State's present and future status. Set against the imminent inauguration of a new administration in Washington, Governor Carey's message is expected to be one of austerity as New York and the rest of the nation look to 1981 as a pivotal year in the fight against inflation and unnecessary growth in government. Lieutenant Governor Mario Cuomo presides over the joint session of the Senate.
The chair is delighted to present the Governor of the State of New York, Hugh L. Carey.
Lieutenant Governor Cuomo, Speaker Fink, Majority Leader Anderson, Controller Reagan, Attorney General Abrams, Reverend Bruner, members of the judiciary, members of the honorable bodies and their families, ladies and gentlemen of the state of New York. 6 years ago, during some of this state's most anxious and trying days, we rediscovered the sense of rigorous cooperation which first created the wealth and well-being of this nation. You and I, Democrats and Republicans, upstaters and downstaters, set aside our differences and, working together as New Yorkers, reversed a long slide toward insolvency. Now we are faced with the sometimes tedious, often frustrating job of guaranteeing that the gains we have won are the foundation of a new era, not a lost opportunity. This is not the first such instance in our history. 200 years ago, in 1781, 6 years after the struggle for independence had begun, a British Army band, trying to find the music to match the moment, stood at Yorktown and played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." The music fit. Americans had shaken an empire and overturn the old beliefs of inherited inequality and the old structures of political and economic injustice. But then came the harder task to translate that victory into the everyday institutions and structures that would fulfill their revolutionary claims. The music played at Yorktown is still appropriate. We've seen a world turned on its head, the assumptions of effortless prosperity and automatic growth shattered, the solvency of public agencies, municipalities, and private corporations endangered, the commercial and industrial productivity of this nation stifled. But here in New York, where those reversals hit early and hard, we refuse to resign ourselves to the supposed hopelessness of our situation or try to disguise the economic emergency. The world had changed, and we changed also, reshaping our government, restoring our sources of wealth, and refounding the partnership of the public and private sectors. Yet this past, of which we can all be proud, is only prelude. In the 1980s, as in the 1780s, we face a task that may lack the stark outlines of our previous struggle, but it is dangerous and difficult and even more demanding. Our system of government was, after all, created by the patient and intricate work that went on in legislative halls such as this, that hammered the passing triumphs of the battlefield into a permanent constitutional achievement to be shared by generation after generation. Now we require that same measure of hope and hard work, sacrifice and common sense. Our achievements are not yet so permanently and firmly rooted that they can endure the recurring tremors of the national economy and ensure that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. This is the work in which we are now engaged, to create a system that embodies the lessons of these last 6 years of common struggle. To begin, we must proceed with the rapid adoption of generally accepted accounting principles, a process we started last year. Yet this is only a more accurate way of keeping the state's books, not a magic formula for wiping away the state's accrued deficit, which requires us to go annually into increasingly volatile credit markets for seasonal loans. We now pay $200 million a year in interest on that debt, money that could be used to rehabilitate the disabled, to educate our children, and to make our streets safer. My executive budget will provide both the resources and a plan to put an end to this annual borrowing nightmare. Simultaneously, to preserve the program of tax cuts that has been a cornerstone of our economic recovery, we must set a cap on state expenditures, limiting spending growth to a percentage of personal income. To make this truly effective, we must also set a statutory limit to spending increases by local governments. These measures gap retirement of our accrued debt and spending caps, strengthen the fiscal reform and reorganization we began 6 years ago. But they alone cannot create the jobs and paychecks that are the raw material of New York's future. This requires a careful expansion of our program of economic development, the tax reduction program that has reduced state taxes by $2.3 billion a year. What I propose today is that we begin a new two-phased, multi-year tax reduction program. The first phase will be directed to boost economic expansion, encourage capital formation, and improve the environment for new and small business in New York. The initial reduction of $300 million will be carefully targeted to stimulate specific sectors of the state's economy and to ensure a quick recovery from the national recession of 1980 and provide a basis for long-term growth. The second phase will concentrate on broad-based personal income tax reduction of $500 million and will be related to both the performance of the state's economy and to the enactment of an expenditure cap. In my travels around this state, during the recent series of budget forums, the people spoke with one voice in their support of tax cuts and an end to government spending increases that diminish incomes already decimated by inflation. Yet austerity, if it is to succeed in its goal of spurring economic growth, cannot be a blind retreat from responsibility. It must be austerity with hope, austerity that is not merely a disguised indifference to the crushing hardships many local governments and individuals already endure. We have, for instance, been the nation's most successful the tax reduction of which I speak must involve a far-reaching restructuring of state and local resources and the responsibilities that will set our course for the next decade. We have, for instance, been the nation's most successful state in controlling Medicaid costs, but despite this, the President's share of the same program will grow to nearly $2.5 billion over the next 6 years. To prevent the increase in local property taxes this would cause, and to assure that the program does not become a casualty of local budget pressures, I will propose a full and systematic assumption of Medicaid cost by the state. This is not a $2.5 billion giveaway or an invitation to develop new spending programs. It is a tax relief program. As we take these costs off the shoulders of local governments, we expect that they, in return, will reduce property taxes. Besides local relief and tax cuts, the state must help replenish the investment and enterprise that first made us the Empire State. I shall seek the required second approval of a constitutional amendment expanding the borrowing capacity of the Job Development Authority. I shall also seek legislation that encourages the greatest capital tool we have in this state, our public employee pension funds, to invest in the state's economic growth. Increased investments by these funds in New York business will allow them to earn a better rate of return and provide additional capital for the state's industries and additional opportunities for mortgage financing. One of the most fundamental lessons we learned or relearned over the past 6 years is that this job of fiscal reform and economic development cannot be the sole responsibility of any one part of our society. Government cannot succeed without the support of the business community, and they, in turn, are powerless without the cooperation of labor. In 1975, the coalition that responded to our fiscal emergency reaffirmed this truth. Since then, we have created 300,000 new private sector jobs, generated new investments in the state, and for the first time in a decade, brought our unemployment rate below that of this nation. Everywhere possible, everywhere it does not endanger or diminish the common good, we shall encourage New Yorkers to give free expression to their commercial and entrepreneurial genius. We shall undertake a comprehensive deregulation of the communications business so this dynamic, developing industry will expand here, helping us to lead the second industrial revolution as we led the first. Most importantly, we shall continue to protect and redevelop the state's investment in its network of transportation, water, and energy resources. Every part of our economy depends on these three resources. For years, however, they were simply taken for granted, and the crisis of the late 1970s forced a further delay in dealing with their repair and restoration. We can delay no longer. During the coming weeks, I shall present a series of recommendations to create the necessary revenue support for public transportation. In particular, we will provide and propose a wide-ranging program to begin the immediate redevelopment of the MTA's capital facilities and to rebuild New York City's mass transit system, the nation's largest and oldest. For this purpose, we expect this year $275 million of federal money and $300 million from the TBTA's 1979 bond authorization. In addition, I am proposing a $1.1 billion capital improvement program. It will include $500 million in new TBTA bonds, $200 million for station improvements, $120 million of state appropriations, $270 million from the 1979 bond, and $60 million in the final phase of the Port Authority's bus purchase program. We shall proceed with the purchase of 270 new subway cars, 130 new commuter rail cars, and rehabilitation of tracks and train yards for both subway and commuter lines. In the face of the current drought, water supply is again a critical issue. Yet there is no more involved and far more to think about than managing a temporary water shortage. The systems in place are a priceless asset, yet in many cases they are over 100 years old and badly deteriorated. This year, I shall propose legislation to establish a water development financing authority. Of immediate importance are protection of the groundwater supplies, completion of the third New York City water tunnel, and the elimination of water pollution caused by landfills. Finally, thank you, Long Island. Finally, in energy, we have made progress in reducing fuel consumption, but we are still paying $15 billion a year for oil. There are two immediate ways to reduce this dangerous dependency: conservation and coal. I shall submit to you legislation authorizing the establishment of an integrated one-stop process for approving the conversion of utility power plants. I shall also ask that you broaden the abilities of the State Power Authority to finance, develop, and operate a greater range of energy production and conservation programs. The challenge of this decade is to make the sacrifices and investments that will provide the foundation to build on what we have achieved. If economic development is to mean anything, it must touch all those families still trapped in the cycle of joblessness, dependency, and despair. In the South Bronx, in Buffalo, in rural and urban areas throughout the state, there are hundreds and thousands who wait for a first chance to share in the opportunities the rest of us speak of renewing. We cannot wait for the federal government to wake up to its responsibilities. As a state, we must use our own tax system to encourage the creation of jobs where they are most desperately needed. This year, I shall ask you to approve a state-targeted employment tax credit creating a dollar and cents incentive to hire the chronically unemployed. I shall submit a comprehensive program of incentives and tax relief to encourage business growth in those areas designated for economic revitalization. As we move ahead with our programs, I shall work with our congressional delegation and the new administration in support of a joint program for targeted job development. Within this administration, we shall continue our unqualified support for affirmative action. We are justifiably proud of our record of bringing minorities into state government. Yet there is still so much more to be done. I shall, for example, ask for legislation that will assure the hiring of a fair proportion of minorities and women in all state-assisted endeavors. Yet, no matter how dramatic our progress in rebuilding our economy, in undoing past injustices, and eliminating past mistakes, we cannot overlook the support we owe to those who are forced to depend on us for their existence. The inflation that hurts every New Yorker ravages the poor most of all. Therefore, as a first order of business, I shall ask you for a public assistance grant increase of 20% over the next 2 years. To relieve those hospitals in financial jeopardy as a result of their service to the poor, I propose we create a special pool to fund the debts they have incurred in this work. The intent of this proposal is to yield over $200 million in the next fiscal year in order to save these institutions and further control escalating medical costs, while cutting back unnecessary wasteful excesses. We have increased the level of health care and become the recognized leader in the care of the mentally handicapped and the physically disabled across this country. In this International Year of the Disabled, we shall continue with these efforts to offer all our citizens the full measure of dignity and independence that is their right. Our primary goal must be to provide people with alternatives to confinement in institutions, to expand the special network of housing, employment opportunities, and medical care that ends forever the shameful segregation of the disabled. Questions, however, have recently been raised about the state's commitment to a mental health system that can balance the rights of the patients with the concerns of their communities. Let me then assure you, the state will not discharge people who cannot care for themselves and for whom no provision has been made. I have directed the Commissioner of Mental Health to ensure that discharge procedures are strictly enforced and, if necessary, made even stronger. Further, regulations will be amended to authorize automatic readmission to a state facility of any person who within 90 days of leaving a psychiatric center requires acute care. As part of this first step in our proposed state assumption of Medicaid costs, I will propose that the full non-federal share of certain Medicaid-funded services for the mentally ill and mentally retarded be paid in full by the state. All of us understand, I know, that the mere multiplication of programs and expenditures will not solve our problems and can, as in the past, often compound them. Our common challenge is to build on what is already in place, to use the full range of our resources to create systems at once efficient and compassionate. This is as true in criminal justice as it is in the other areas of our concern. Yet all our attempts at economic revitalization, at consolidating the progress of these past 6 years, will mean little if we cannot secure the safety of life and property and halt the current wave of crime. I am not speaking here about highly publicized maneuvers that collar headlines rather than criminals, but a concerted, coordinated effort to strengthen our police forces, end the insane proliferation of handguns, reform our criminal justice system, and provide swift and certain punishment for those convicted of crime. In 1980, we joined together to enact the toughest gun control law in the nation. Yet, the continued rise in murders and assaults committed with these weapons means we must pursue even stricter enforcement. Last month, I attended the funeral of Robert Van Hall, a New York State trooper shot and killed in the line of duty. There is no more painful task for a governor. Without delay, I ask you to pass a bill that mandates life without parole for those convicted of such crimes. This could be put into effect now without serious constitutional challenge. We need as well to strengthen our corrections system, to expand the numbers of police, and concentrate our resources against the repeat offenders who commit a large share of crimes. I have included in my executive budget a $44 million increase in corrections to improve both security and rehabilitation programs. I shall ask you to approve $10.4 million to set up a major offense police program in cities and counties where the battle against crime is most severe. These units will focus on the arrest of violent felons and on breaking up the growing traffic in handguns and drugs. To expand the resources of the courts to deal with these arrests, I will ask again for another $6 million for a major offense prosecution program. The tougher laws already enacted and the additional resources we are providing to our courts and prosecutors have meant a higher conviction rate and longer sentences for violent offenders. Our state prisons are now crammed near capacity, despite the addition of over 5,000 beds since 1975. It is crucial that we build new prisons and make capital investments in our entire criminal justice system, and therefore I shall seek a $375 million public safety bond authorization program. These measures will help in bringing the full weight of the law against those whose violent acts rend the fabric of trust and security that holds a society together. But this prolonged crisis of violence involves more than simply slamming prison gates behind people. First of all, in court case after court case, in cities and towns across this state, the manufacture, sale, and effects of narcotics are involved. In New York City alone, there has been a 25% increase in felony narcotic arrests for children under 16. To ensure that the courts deal with this problem, I shall propose that the state funding for the New York City Special Narcotics Prosecutor be significantly increased. Further, we will begin a complete restructuring of the State Division of Criminal Justice, including the creation of an executive commission on the administration of justice chaired by Arthur Lyman, a gifted and accomplished member of the New York Bar. This commission will review the spectrum of criminal justice issues, from the causes of crime to the role of the courts in preventing it, from the effectiveness of our criminal justice system and agencies to the possibilities for a major reform of the system. I shall also ask approval for a sentencing panel that will open the entire sentencing process to public scrutiny and establish an exchange of information among prosecutors, judges, and the parole board. The panel would eliminate the present disparities in sentencing, which often create cynicism and resentment. Finally, I join with all New Yorkers in extending our good wishes to President-elect Reagan and his administration. He faces crises at home and abroad as serious as any president has ever confronted. Yet, with a carefully structured national program of tax reduction and reform on the lines of what we have done here, the federal government can move to restore business confidence and to encourage new investments in plant and equipment. Certainly, no one can be allowed to imagine that we will accept abandonment and emigration as the answers to the problems of New York and the Northeast. Just as important, we need a greatly expanded energy conservation program, starting with increased federal support for public transit systems. We need a strong federal commitment to increase the use of coal, the production of natural gas, and the development of renewable energy resources. Our program in energy conservation, urban revitalization, and health care cost containment stand as examples of effective government. The new administration and the Congress should begin to examine systematically the full range of domestic programs and, wherever appropriate, delegate their management to the states. But this must not be seen as an excuse by the federal government to abdicate its fiscal obligations. There is much more from my legislative program that I would speak about this afternoon, if time permitted. Education, housing, consumer protection, civil service reform, agriculture, and parks. Yet, in all these areas, there is the same single underlying need to accept the disciplines of austerity as the source of hope. Our shared sacrifice of these past 6 years has put an end to the myth of the me generation and reaffirmed the stunning boast that first appeared in our Constitution, the ideal of we, that generations of Americans have fought to realize. We, the people, men and women, old and young, black and white, privileged and underprivileged alike, we've learned again that this sense of common struggle and uncommon dedication is the first necessity of survival, that each of us can succeed separately only so far as we succeed together. No agency of government alone, but the people themselves, all of us, must see to the nurture of our young and the care of our elderly, the safety of our streets, and the spirit of our neighborhoods, the health and bounty of our forests and factories. Without that involvement, government, no matter the expenditures, can never succeed. With it, we can change the world. To all of you, I extend the blessings of a Happy New Year. God bless you, and may you have a wonderful session and a most Happy New Year to the people of New York State. Thank you.
In his 1981 State of the State address, Governor Hugh Carey has called for a phased-in takeover of local Medicaid costs by the state while proposing spending limits for state and local governments. The governor said he will put forward $800 million in business and personal income tax cuts. He also urged a multi-million-dollar program to fight crime. This coverage of Governor Hugh Carey's State of the State address has been produced by the Executive Chamber Press Office through the facilities of the New York Network, a service of the State University of New York.